On the morning of the 12th of March, Captain Lashkevich walked into the barracks of the Volinsky Regiment. There he informed them that morning they were going to be shooting at protesters again. The troops refused. Either they shot him, or Lashkevich committed suicide. Either way, the mutiny had begun. The Volinsky Regiment got to work, recruiting other soldiers to their mutinies, and telling protesters where to find stockpiles of guns. By the end of the day, 160,000 soldiers would be part of the mutiny. By the end of the week, the central government would have lost control of the country. The replacement government that was set up was called the Provisional Government. However, this was barely a government. The workers' militia that had replaced the police force did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. The Russian army did not like them and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. They'd overthrown the last government easy peasy apple squashy, and they could do it again. The peasantry all just wanted a slice of their landlord's estate, which the Provisional Government did not want to give them. So the peasants did not like the Provisional Government and could not be counted on to defend the regime if push came to shove. So you may be wondering, how did the Provisional Government even last a week without getting overthrown? Well, it was because of an institution known as the Petrograd Soviet. They were the city council of the capital city of Russia, and they were actually popular. They used their popularity to make people obey the Provisional Government. But if the two governments ever threw hands, then the army would side with the Soviet. Nevertheless, while most places in Russia still had some influence from the Provisional Government, some were just electing councils to run the place without any Provisional Government influence. Meanwhile, on the war front against Germany and Austria, everything was going to hell. The soldiers were losing any and all discipline, disregarding orders from officers, and in some units they murdered people for talking in favour of war. Everyone in Russia wanted the war to end. But Russia had made a bunch of promises to the Allies, and the Provisional Government wanted to keep those promises, and that means they couldn't leave the war. Therefore, instead of leaving the war, they began trying to restore order in their army. Meanwhile, there would be the first of several uprisings against the Provisional Government. On the 1st of May, a letter was sent to the Allied governments saying that the Soviet wanted the Russian people to oppose imperialist aims, as they wanted, quote, peace without annexations or contributions. However, the message came with a note from the Provisional Government attached, saying that Russia did intend to fulfill their obligations to the Allies, and it also said that the desire to continue the war had only flourished with the revolution. This was absolutely not correct, it was a lie. The people were furious. On the 3rd of May, 2 days later, a regiment of Finnish soldiers, fully armed, began demonstrating against this. They demanded the resignation of the guy that wrote that note, even though loads of people agreed to have that note sent. Other units joined in, and pretty soon, there were 25 to 30,000 soldiers demonstrating. And oh my god, I cannot imagine the utter terror felt by the Provisional Government. This was exactly how the Tsar got overthrown. However, shots had not been fired yet, and until they were fired, the government was not doomed yet. If they could keep things from escalating, then maybe everyone would go home. So the people from the Soviet gave a bunch of speeches, and convinced all the soldiers to go back to their barracks, and they all lived happily ever after. Until the next day, when more demonstrations occurred, this time by civilians and not by soldiers. They started off with demonstrations against Malyukov, the leader of the Cadet Party, the last non-socialist party in the government. He was also the guy who wrote that note. There were then a bunch of counter-demonstrations in favour of Malyukov. Garrison Commander Kornilov suggested they use force to crush this dissent. The government was more pragmatic, telling him to stand down. But just in case, he did order some units to mobilise anyway, to stand guard, just in case. And you'll never guess how those units reacted to those orders. The soldiers asked the Soviet whether or not they should follow that order. The Soviet responded by decreeing that no soldiers should be out on the street unless they said so or unless it was a routine operation. And the soldiers obeyed that order. After a couple of days, the protests stopped and everybody went home. With disaster averted, the Provisional Government agreed to put together a new cabinet. The Cadet Party, mentioned earlier, agreed to join this new cabinet under a few conditions. Notably, that the government agreed upon an offensive against Germany. Currently, their army was in a terrible state. Soldiers were deserting home in droves. The Russian army was collapsing. A successful offensive, the cadets believed, would halt or slow the disintegration of the army, which is a good idea, until you remember that the army was disintegrating in droves, and in some units, it was dangerous to speak in favour of launching an offensive. Minister for War, Alexander Kerensky, went round the army giving speeches to boost morale, which did work because he was so good, but as soon as he left, all morale in the Russian army went with him. The offensive began on the 1st of July, and there was some initial success, as the Austrians were demoralised, but then the Germans showed up to reinforce the Austrians, and everything went to heck. The offensive was intended to save the Russian war effort. It had the opposite effect. The failure of the offensive pushed the Russians out of Austrian territory entirely and sped up the disintegration of the army. Then, in the capital city, there was a revolution against the government. If you want to see how that plays out, click on this video, appearing on the end screen now.